Hi, welcome everybody. I have with me Jay Smith, who, as you know, is on Fanda Films YouTube channel. He is also somewhat of a Quranic expert and all-round good guy Christian. I also have Robert Spencer, who is of Jihad Watch, the website, which the clue is in the title. He is also an author, as well as Jay, and his forthcoming book is a revised, and expanded version of a book he has previously written called Did Mohammed Exist? And that is available now on Amazon to pre-order and should be out around July of next year. And I will put the link in the description box for that, and also for Jay's back catalogue as well. With that, our chosen topic today is centered around the broader subject in Robert's forthcoming book, and it's the historicity of Muhammad, who is better known maybe as the Prophet of Islam. And with that, I think the guys are going to give 3 of their best reasons why he does not exist, and then I'm just going to look really stumped for a little while, try to make some counter argument, and then we'll just have a general discussion as to the ramifications potentially of his non-existence or his continued existence, as it were. And with that, I guess I'm going to go over to Jay, and we'll go around in a circle kind of thing. So welcome, Jay.
Well, thanks, Kay. Listen, I'm here really to listen to Robert. I would like to know what he thinks about all this new material. And also, I would like to hear from Robert why suddenly 2020, this has just exploded. What's going on? Suddenly, you've had your book out, Robert, since 2012. That's been out 8 years. We've had to digest it. Many of us have worked on it. But suddenly this year, 2020, 2 things have happened. One has been that interview about the Qira'at and the Ahruf that happened on June 8th with Yasser Qadhi and Mohammed Hijab. And that has taken a life of its own. It's known as Holes in the Narrative. That's the title that's given to that discussion. And that has been going right across the internet. People have lost their jobs. Muslims have left Islam. There has been an enormous amount of backlash from the Muslims. And we're just sitting tight and pretty because we've known that this is going to happen. We didn't know it was going to happen that quick. Simultaneously, your material on Did Muhammad Exist has suddenly come frothing to the surface. And people like Mel from Sneakers Corner, and also Bala from Sneakers Corner, and also our good friend Murad from Sneakers. They're all 3 from Sneakers Corner, but they're from 3 different countries. One, Mel, is from, he doesn't want me to tell you where he's from, but it's in Europe. I would say another guy named Joe, who is also from Europe, and then Murad from the Middle East, and then Bala from India. They have been working on this material for over 20 years. And I had been working on it for 25 years, ever since I did my first debate on it with Dr. Jamal Badawi back in 1995 at Cambridge University. So those of us who've been working at it in the background and letting it simmer and simmer and simmer and simmer, your book came out in 2012, Robert, and really exploded it. And that really gave a real impetus. But I didn't know you back then, so we really didn't have any contact. But in 2020, suddenly, an enormous amount of new material has just come to light in the coins and in the inscriptions. And also, we think we now know who the original Muhammad was. But all this was not around a year ago. What's going on here? Robert, maybe you can help us.
I really, I wish I could. I think the major thing that I would liken it to is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And you may recall that in the mid-'80s, the early '80s, people were saying the Soviet Union is here to stay. We have to pursue détente. We have to figure out some way to get along with them. And it was only Ronald Reagan and a few others who thought, no, this whole superstructure is ripe for destruction. We just need to give it a little push. And he turned out to be right when nobody else saw it coming. And within a few years, the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed. I think it's the same kind of thing here. You're very generous and kind to say that my first edition of Did Muhammad Exist in 2012 exploded this into the public consciousness, but I rather think that it's been your pushing and your colleagues debating Muslims going back to Badawi in 1995 and continuing to show, like, for example, the famous incidents of showing all the Qur'at at Speaker's Corner in London, in Hyde Park, and Muslims getting so angry and trying to snatch the Qur'ans away from you as you're leaving. these kinds of things made for an atmosphere where Muhammad Hijab and Yasser Qadi and others could no longer ignore or simply deny and dismiss the fact that there are different versions of the Quran. They couldn't pretend anymore that the Quran has been perfectly preserved and the text has never been altered and every last manuscript of the Quran is identical to every other manuscript. It was just too obvious. The weight of the evidence was too much. And I think that's what led to the notorious discussion that you mentioned between the two of them earlier this year. And the fact that others, Shabir Ali and others, have had to say that there are different copies, different editions, different versions of the Quranic text. They simply have to, because it's patently obvious to everyone. And so their old apologetic tactics don't work anymore. They have to formulate new ones and come up with some way to explain all this that has happened. All this that has come to light, I should say.
One of the, and Kate, jump in at any time.
Yeah, what I'd like to just add is that we, of course, know that well, if you're defending the truth, there's absolutely nothing wrong with trying to verify historically, discounting religious scripture as the clear historical evidence of the Bible, for example. There are people who have, for at least 300 years, attested to and researched the historical reality of Jesus. And I think that potentially Islam is way behind in that because of the red line and because of the fact that Islam views it as a sacred scripture. However, academics are not necessarily bound by this view, as it were. So I'm going to let Jay go on, but I'm hoping to hear your solid reasons, because I'm on the fence, to be honest. So, yeah.
Okay. Before we get into that, could I suggest something else is going on simultaneously? There are two different debates going on. One is the debate with Islam, which obviously is a debate they don't want to get involved in. And then there's also a debate within Christianity. And this happened last Saturday with David and myself, the debate that we had on this very subject. And you have two polarizing positions, but I don't think they necessarily need to be polarized. But I'd like you to, again, Robert, you know what I'm talking about. You're talking about the myth makers that we're called myth makers and the realists. That's the two names they give it. The realists would be those that adopt the Islamic traditions, adopt Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, all the Al-Tabari. These are the four genre, the traditions that Muhammad that they paint in the 9th and 10th century is the real Muhammad. And what we're doing, you and I are doing, and people like Mel and Joe and Murad and Bala, really, there's only about 5 of us who are doing this. Those of us who are kind of saying, no, wait a minute, there's a whole nother narrative that's missing, and that's the 7th century narrative, that we're myth makers for introducing that. What do you think about that?
I was sort of taken aback by that coming from people who are in this field and who deal with the texts, some of the ones that you listed just now, all the time, because it seems to me to be basic. Everybody should know. Obviously, David Wood knows, and many, many other people know, that Bukhari, Muslim, all the rest of the Sahih Sita, the reliable Hadith collections, the Sirat literature, it's all from the 8th century at the earliest, the mid-8th century, and most of it is from the 9th century. So we're talking about 150 to 200 years or more after Muhammad is supposed to have lived. This is not controversial. This is not disputed. These things are readily establishable from even Islamic sources, that there simply isn't any early attestation of Muhammad's existence. And so I'm surprised that we're being called myth makers. I was very taken aback watching your debate with David that he was talking repeatedly, calling us conspiracy theorists, as if we have some, and putting up that graphic of the people with the tinfoil hats on, as if this is some nutty, crazy thing. The contrast struck me between his attitude in this debate and his attitude in the debate that he and I had on the same topic 8 years ago. There was none of this sneering, none of the charges of conspiracy theorizing and so on. Maybe I've forgotten, but I don't think that he was anything but completely gracious about the whole issue. Now, I have nothing but respect for David and a great deal of regard and admiration for his extraordinary work in confronting the inhumanity of Islamic teaching, confronting the falsehood of it, exposing so many things that I think probably many Muslims don't know about the contents of Islamic texts and teachings regarding Muhammad, regarding Islam in general. And so that has not changed and is not going to change. But the reality is that I thought it was very strange. It maybe even seemed a little bit defensive that he had to be so dismissive of this point of view. And I don't, maybe you can explain why you think that was. I can't imagine why, because ultimately I don't see that there's any disagreement between showing that Muhammad was a pedophile, a rapist, a warlord, all these things, and saying that these things don't have historical accuracy, that there was no person who did all these things. Because obviously Muslims believe that the Muhammad who is depicted in the Hadith and the Sirah is the prophet. And thus we have to confront, as Christians, as all people of goodwill actually have to confront the fact that Muslims believe that this man is the perfect man, and try to show them that, well, that's anything but perfection, and try to alert also non-Muslims to the reality that Islam is not a religion of peace, but teaches all these horrible things. That is completely compatible.
Let me explain what was going on there and what you're picking up, and it's other people picked it up as well. If you go up onto David Wood's Act 17 apologetics, to that debate, about 63,000 people have watched it now. Look at the comments, and the comments reflect what you're saying. There's a comment after comment after comment. David, what's wrong with you? You lost this debate. Why are you name calling? Why is it you only kept to one point all the way through? You kept repeating your point. You kept repeating principle of embarrassment, principle of embarrassment, principle of embarrassment, and then you talk about the psychological problems with Muhammad because he didn't have a father, his father figure, which is, it's path. It's nothing really. But what was happening, and people didn't know the background to that. We had been there the whole weekend, David and I and Sam Shamoon. And if you know anything about David and Sam, they play on each other. And there is this, and that's what was happening the whole weekend. And the whole weekend, David was mocking me. Oh, here's the book of the man. Here's the book of the man, book of the man, book of the man, because that's the phrase I always use. And then he was saying, I'm going to destroy him. I'm going to destroy him. Watch and see. I'm going to destroy him in the debate. So that's the background. And I don't get into that. I just sit. It's like two of these boxers before they start a fight. They sit and stare each other down. That's what David was doing with me. He was trying to stare me down. I'm too old for that. I got gray hair, and I'm not sitting there. I could not stare him back. There's no way I could keep up with David with his repartee. He's quick on the uptake, and he's terrific at that kind of parlance. I'm not. It's not my generation. So when the debate started, he was still in that mode. And that's, as soon as I saw that he needed to shut down that mode and get into debate mode, which was okay. But when I had to laugh, though, remember at the very beginning, he says, Muslims, I'm on your side in this debate. You got to agree with me. It was everything I could do to keep from laughing, because I knew where he was going to go with this. I didn't know that he was going to use your material. I didn't know that he was just going to use the very same points, the same 8 points he gave to you. I had a blank piece of paper waiting to write down all his major points. I didn't put pen to paper at all. I didn't need to. I just looked at the copy that I had made from your debate, and I just checked off every one of the categories that you had put up, or that he had put up, and you had completely destroyed 8 years ago. And that's why I was surprised that he hadn't moved on for 8 years. But let's get back to this idea. I still like to know, maybe, Kay, listening to what we've been saying right now, you still hold for the position that he did exist. So you would hold David's position.
Not necessarily. What I would like to say in defense of David's position, and I haven't actually seen the video, but I can imagine the man in the book, book and the man, book and the man thing, that just makes me laugh. But what I would say is if someone resorts to personalizing stuff, it generally means they don't have much in the way of like academic defense. But my personal position is, before I ever spoke to you, I was not because of the principle of embarrassment came once I heard that people were suggesting he didn't exist, because my feeling was very much, hey, if I was going to create this super guy, this guy to rival Jesus, this best of all mankind, this super duper example, the prevailing myth or the prevailing narrations that I hear about Muhammad's life and the Sunnah are not the ones I would choose. Not only are they not the ones I would choose, they are the polar opposite in many respects, like the child marriage, the murder, the advocating lying, and all of these things. So in defense of David's position, potentially, I mean, that is a very strong argument. Whether or not it has historical value, and if it doesn't necessarily counter your many historical evidences, it in and of itself, people prefer, human nature is to die for the truth, which is what we always argue about the apostles. They the prevailing nature and his popularization, I'm sure myth has been interspersed, but that would be my feeling, although I'm now unsure. But that is a very strong reservation of mine, that I can't get my mind around. Why invent someone who I wouldn't even want to have a drink with, let alone like put next to or just below my God? Like, yeah, so my feeling is I'm unsure, although there has to be someone or some people upon whom these things are based because of the timing. Like within Arabia, certain things happened at certain times, and then it just spread throughout the world. And that doesn't generally happen just because some guy goes, oh, I think I'm just going to tell my neighbor about this imaginary dude. Like, so that's how I feel.
Robert, why don't you answer her? Robert's got a great answer to this. I want to hear him do it. Go ahead now, Robert.
Well, consider this. You know how people say that travel is broadening because if you go to another place, you see that people behave differently and have different attitudes and assumptions from the ones in your own home, in your own area. And so people have always counseled that travel is a great cure for a kind of parochialism and narrowness, and a perspective on the world that might be a little bit too simplistic. Now, the problem with David's position, or the problem with, I should say, the whole idea that of the principle of embarrassment, is that also it is broadening to it's chronologically parochial. To go back to read especially ancient literature, to read literature from any other time or place, is also broadening. It's like a certain kind of traveling while sitting in your own chair. It is to encounter people who have different perspectives and outlooks and views on life, ones that you would never imagine. And that is the explanation in general of why it is that a person might be invented who is so noxious to us as Muhammad is, who is so absolutely outrageously unappealing. And people think this is the perfect man. This is the model of all conduct. This is the prototypical human being, because those were their values. The values of the people who put him together are reflected in their product. And so they had marriages to children, and they thought there's nothing wrong with marriages to children. We'll make our prophet marry a child just to make sure that this is something that is behavior that is enshrined. Actually, you see, there's another aspect to this that's related and connected to this as well. And that is that there were differing factions in the Muslim world. Jay emphasized in the debate with David just now that Islam as we know it is a product of the Abbasid Caliphate. And this is something that corresponds with my own work in Did Muhammad Exist? That the Abbasids charged the Umayyads, the preceding caliphate that ended in the year 750, with irreligion, because they were coming in with what we know of as Islam, which had not been formulated in anything like the way that it is now during the Umayyad period. But there was a great long period of flux in which you have people of different factions, and not just the Umayyads and Abbasids either, but others as well, who are vying for hegemony in this group. And once the idea of Muhammad as a prophet, as an individual, gets established, and people are inventing various stories about him, even the Muslim sources agree that stories were invented in order to support the point of view of a particular faction on a particular issue. So that, for example, you have Bukhari, the collector of hadith, and he supposedly went around the Islamic world and collected 300,000 stories of Muhammad's words and deeds. Then he rejected 293,000 of them as inauthentic and kept 7,000. And even those are full of repetition.
Can I just correct that, Robert? I think it's 600,000, and he brought it down to 7,397. So
600,000. I have 300,000 in the book. I'll have to check my source, but
go and correct that.
Whilst you're arguing about,
but in any case, it's a whole lot of stories that he rejected,
hundreds of thousands
that are considered to be forgeries. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of stories of Muhammad that Muslims will tell you are forgeries. Now, the ones that remain have no greater value historically. They don't date from the 7th century. They're not attested by oral tradition. In their existence is not referred to. There is nothing. It is just that they reflected the party that won out, the point of view of the party that won out. The party that won out may have wanted child marriage, may have wanted especially a warrior prophet, so that they could point to the example of their prophet, because they themselves were warriors and they wanted to expand their empire and protect it. And so they needed to invent a prophet who would hold up war as a value, and so on. You can take every one of the strange things that David notes and many others and explain it in a way that makes sense in light of the perspective of the people who are inventing the stories. Like, one of the most difficult is, as they discussed in the debate, is in Surah 33 of the Quran, where Muhammad marries his ex-daughter-in-law. He, according to a hadith, his daughter-in-law was very beautiful, Zainab, and he went to see her. He went to see his son, actually, his adopted son, Zayd, and Zainab opened the door. She wasn't fully dressed. Muhammad went away, overcome with the impression of her beauty. And Zayd comes to him later, because he did not have a happy marriage. And he says, how about I divorce her and you take her? And Muhammad said, no, keep your wife and fear Allah. And then later, Allah tells Muhammad, you shouldn't have rejected this. I want you to marry Zainab. And so Muhammad wakes up out of his trance and says, who will tell Zainab that Allah has married her to me? And so this is this terrible story of Muhammad being a lustful individual who can't control himself and ends up seizing the wife of his adopted son. And people, Christian apologists and many others, have pointed to this throughout history and said, see, your prophet is somebody who can't control himself and is overcome with lust. He's hardly an example of human behavior. But what is a telling aspect of the story that is often overlooked is that when it's told in very elliptical and fragmented fashion in the Quran, it's really just alluded to in the Quran itself and then elucidated at greater length in the Hadith. The Quran ends up with the episode in chapter 33, verse 40 by saying, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the seal of the prophets. And the adopted son is disavowed, because adoption is disallowed in the same chapter of the Quran. So the whole thing, some people have posited, particularly a scholar, David Powers, has posited that the whole thing is about the fact that in Hadith literature, you'll also find the idea that all the prophets are related. Of course, the Quran notoriously says that Jesus is Moses' nephew, because they call Mary, his mother, the sister of Aaron, his brother, confusing her with Miriam, the sister of Moses, because it's the same word in Arab, same name in Arabic, Maryam. So if all the prophets are related, if all the prophets are related, if Muhammad has a son, even an adopted son, then he is also a prophet, because Muhammad's prophetic gift would pass on. That's what the Shiites think to this day, that the household of Muhammad has something of his prophetic spirit, and that's why the imams, as the successors of Muhammad, have to be related to Muhammad, because then they will carry on his prophetic call. But if Muhammad has no sons, then he's the seal of the prophets. And that, if you were an Islamic state that wants to center your polity around this warrior prophet, and you want to make sure that no other prophets arise who could disrupt this state and maybe cause even a civil war, then you put in this story that shows he doesn't have a natural son, he doesn't have an adopted son, he's the last prophet. And so this is the one you all have to rally around, and there can be no more prophets. All these people are pretenders that we can put to death. They are not people anybody should take seriously. So even that story doesn't necessarily, even though it's deeply embarrassing to Muslims from the standpoint of any rational morality, or certainly of Christian morality, nonetheless, it doesn't necessarily establish anything regarding the historicity of the figure discussed.
Okay, so on that point, that was a lot of information, but I'm just going to quickly, I'm not texting people, by the way, I'm just writing notes on my phone, because last time I got some grief for holding my phone. I'm going to briefly jot through what I was thinking as you were speaking. So when you talk about the normalization of pre-held values that aren't necessarily our Western values, or are the antithesis of our Western values, what I would counter that with is that even though it was 500 to 600 years difference, there were Jews in the area, there were Christians, those were the two biggest religions within the area. Okay, I'm going to disagree with Jay. I'm going to go ahead and say they were present within it was a trading area. The heretical, Jay, stop waffling, stop waving me. Right, so there were,
wrong at every one of those points.
hold your horses, I'm coming to you. So there were theists, and there were Nasara, there were people who had access to heretical and Christian writings, and the Torah, if we believe the story of Muhammad, venerating it, was extant. Whether or not he could read it or not, the people around were not prone, I don't believe, to child marriage as we would understand it, as in 6 years old and consummation. They were for sure, 13, I think, is the current bat mitzvah age. So yeah, I'll agree that it was slightly lower than westernized countries of today, but I don't believe that the prevailing, like the pre-existent religions before Islam was revealed or crowbarred into this area were, maybe the pagans were, I don't know much about them, but the Christians and the Jews certainly were not. So I would argue that if you want to include Isa as a counterfeit Christ in your great narrative, or in your divine revelation, and to describe him as the word of Allah, and have him as righteous or pure in Surah 19, then you need to out-pure him to make your guy the best example. So that's one thing. Jay, I'm hurrying up, I promise. So the tradition of, grading hadith, because you say, then they threw out so many accounts of him, that it could lend credence to the fact that the ones that remained were by some systematic, going through, were deemed to be sahih, although of course the hadiths, like you said earlier, probably 9th century when it's established as a science, sorry. And the Quran, of course, doesn't really contain much about Muhammad in terms of like proper narratives, more just kind of glancing, reference. So we as Christians have no problem nowadays. When I was younger, I heard oftentimes Christians, even priests and vicars, saying that the God of Islam, and they still do to some extent, is the one true God, even though now, if you read the Quran, you can be accused of hate speech by literally just reading it. Me personally, I don't have any problem with a fake Jibril. I know that's not Gabriel. Muhammad, in his first instance, in his gut reaction was, that's not Gabriel, that is a demon. I've also no problem whatsoever in declaring that Allah is not Yahweh, because of Allah's own words on the subject. and on the subject of marriage, on the subject of lying, on the subject of murder, on the subject of jizya, end time prophecies, all of those things do not tie up to my God. And I also have no problem. So back to David, on the one hand, my knee-jerk reaction is that it would be pretty disheartening, maybe, to spend years and years studying a character who is attested to as a real historical figure, only to kind of have the rug pulled out beneath you, even though it goes for your cause in the ridicule and the, the presumption is, and I know it to be true, David is doing this in order to lead people out of Islam so they can therefore, please God, be led into salvation. But still, it's a kind of kick in the teeth, as in, the guy didn't exist in the first place. Why didn't I just go with something else? But at the same time, I'm sure David obviously realizes that Allah isn't God, Jibril isn't Gabriel, Maryam for sure is not Mary, because she's a very young looking Maryam while she's under the palm tree. She doesn't look 1200 years old, or however, previous Aaron was. So yeah, those are my counters to your points. I would have to look into it much more than the half an hour I spent looking into it earlier. Maybe I'll get your older version of the book and fill myself in for the next time. Jake, over to you.
Go ahead, Robert.
Well, there's just one thing about David again, and that was to complete the point I was making earlier. I just find it puzzling that I don't see any difficulty, any discrepancy here. Like in what you're saying right now, Kay, I really just don't get it. Actually, though, maybe I should, because for years now, Muslims have made this point to me. They say, you're completely inconsistent. You've made the mother of all flip-flops. That was actually the exact words of an Islamic apologist speaking to me. He said, you wrote a biography of Muhammad based on the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, obviously through Ibn Hisham and the Sirah literature and the Hadith and so on. And then you write a book saying that none of it is historical. And I don't see any contradiction there at all, because Muslims still believe this canonical story of Muhammad. And insofar as they do, then what David does and Sam and all the others, and what I do to a tremendous degree as well, is to show them that these things are inhuman, that these things lead to violence and oppression, they lead to ruining people's lives, and that there's a better way to live. Sure. And that the fact that these things did not happen doesn't change that in the slightest degree. It's like saying, well, Macbeth never really was king of Scotland.
You what?
And so
You're joking me. All right, cut this all off. I can't believe it.
Yeah, but you see what I mean? That if we say that Macbeth is not a historical figure, then we can't quote him in the Shakespeare play. No, the Shakespeare play is what it is, and he says what he says in it. And so we can have all kinds of discussions about the significance of that and the meaning of that. But that doesn't mean that he actually lived. And it's the same thing here. I don't see any contradiction. So I still don't know why David would find it necessary. I mean, I guess as a debating tactic, I can see it. That you want to try to rock back your opponent, you want to try to intimidate a little bit. It's actually a tactic that Islamic apologists love to use, to try to put the Christian speaker on the defensive, maybe sow a little doubt in your mind, so that you're off balance, and then you can't present your best case in the best way. As a tactic, sure, but otherwise I don't see any justification for acting as if it's some nutty conspiracy theory. The other thing you asked me right at the beginning was to list 3 reasons why I don't think that Muhammad, as he's depicted in the Sirah and the Hadith, is historical. And one of the primary reasons for that, and one of the reasons why this is not a nutty conspiracy theory, is that for the first nearly a century, and certainly for the first 60 years after Muhammad is supposed to have died, then you don't have anything about him and virtually no mention of him. There are a couple of scattered mentions here and there of Muhammad in non-Muslim literature. And then there's no Muslim literature about this whatsoever. And so you don't start to hear about Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, or Islam itself, or the Quran, until the last decade of the 600s and the early part of the 700s. And that is, Muhammad died in 632, so that's an extraordinary gap. If you compare, and this is another useful thing to do, in the first place, though, I have to add the caveat that the situations are completely different. Muhammad may be completely fictional, and that doesn't have anything to do with the historical investigations of Christianity. Many, many people, when with the first edition of Did Muhammad Exist came out, and I was going on radio shows and talking about it, so many radio hosts asked me, well, what about Jesus? Can't you say the same things about Jesus? And so I had to say, well, in the first place, that's completely irrelevant, because it's just two separate situations and they may have nothing to do with one another. But also it's a useful analogy, because the Lord Jesus died and rose from the dead in the early part of the 30s of the first century. So it's roughly analogous to Muhammad in 632 dying, 600 years before. And so if you look at the 30s, when Jesus dies and rises again, then you look at the 90s, 60 years later, you have the New Testament has been written, you have non-Christians speaking about the existence of Christianity and of churches, you have churches all around the Mediterranean area, you have the post-Christian writers, Clement of Rome and so on, writing and making reference to various passages of the New Testament. So you have a great deal of attestation of the existence of the Lord Jesus, a tremendous amount, much more than you have in the case of Muhammad, where, just by contrast, in the year 638, 637, 638, thereabouts, the Arab armies conquered Jerusalem. Now, you would expect, if this was 6 years after Muhammad, and if Muhammad was real, if Muhammad was the false prophet that David talks about, that if Muhammad had told us everything that we have now in the Hadith, that it was all spoken the way that it's depicted in the Hadith, that he said it all, and the Quran was all together, all written, not collected together, but the entirety of the Quran, because after all, it was revealed to Muhammad. So by 638, if the canonical story is true, then the Muslims have the Quran, and they have this incredible wealth of material. It's an oral tradition, but that's not disqualifying, because this was a time when people had, when in oral cultures, people had prodigious memories. Homer and the Greek bards, they memorized all of the Iliad and the Odyssey, no problem. And so the Hadith literature may have been all preserved orally, but it had to exist if it all comes from Muhammad. So in 638, because Muhammad said, and the Quran says, to make war against the unbelievers and subjugate them and so on, they conquer Jerusalem. One would think that they're talking all about their prophet, all about their new religion, all about their holy book, because that's why they did this, right? And so there's a very famous story, a legendary story, of Sophronius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And he meets Umar, the Caliph, at the gates of Jerusalem and shows him around the city. And at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the church that houses the tomb of Christ, where he rose from the dead, Sophronius invites him in and says, go in and say a prayer. And Umar magnanimously and generously, graciously says, no, I won't go in and pray there, because if I do, then my followers will claim it for a mosque, and I'm going to leave this church for you Christians. That story is told to this day as an example of Islamic tolerance. However, that story also, like the Hadith, doesn't date from anything earlier than the 9th century. We only hear about it first in the 800s. In the 600s, though, we have writings of Sophronius himself, We have actually quite extensive writings of Sophronius himself, and in them, he never mentions Umar, he never mentions Islam, he never mentions the Quran, he never mentions Muhammad, even though he says that these invaders came, they laid waste to the churches, they sowed great havoc and destruction, they were God's judgment on the area. He speaks to a tremendous, at great length, about the theological meaning of the destruction of Christian Jerusalem. And nowhere does he say these people had a new religion or a new prophet or a new holy book. Now, that's an extraordinary omission. If these people came in with the words of their new prophet ringing in their ears and their oral traditions about their prophet memorized and their Quran memorized, and they're very proud of their new religion, that's the impetus for their conquest, why don't they ever mention it? Why doesn't he doesn't even give any indication that he knows anything about it. And every other non-Muslim writer who encounters the invaders all through the 7th century has the same experience. They give no hint anywhere that they have this new religion. Now you contrast that with the missionary travels of St. Paul, the formulation of the New Testament, the epistles, the establishment of churches in Asia Minor and in Europe. There's nothing analogous to that. We have the conquests, but none of the what is supposed to be the theological and ideological superstructure of those conquests.
Okay, so I'd like to, seeing as how I've literally got 2 experts on the subject, just a cursory, like a quick search of some internet stuff. And I have a claim, at least, that somebody called Thomas the Presbyter, who is apparently an early Syriac source and a Christian writer, dating to around 640, gives the earliest mention of Muhammad and tells us that his followers made a raid around Gaza. So that's like close in time, as opposed to, your rightly stated, he doesn't seem to appear for a little while. And another Syrian manuscript mentions Muhammad and the Arab conquests, and this also comes from the year 634. So that's 2 years after Muhammad died. In a catalogue of Syriac manuscripts in the British Museum. And yeah, basically someone called W. Wright has dated them to around 636 or around that time. So those are 3 that I think Jay can speak on, if I'm right in my...
Robert, go ahead. That's the presbyter, Thomas the Presbyter, and Doctrina Iacobi. How would you answer those 2?
Well, they are mentions of Muhammad. There's no doubt about that. But that's all they are, is mentions of Muhammad. They don't notably mention Islam or the Quran. They don't give us any details about Muhammad, except things that aren't true, according to the canonical Islamic story.
Just correct one thing. The Doctrina Iacobi does not mention Muhammad.
Is that the one that says he's the prophet?
That's the one that's 634. That does not mention Muhammad. It just says a prophet who's in Jerusalem, who's from the Saracen, a Saracen prophet.
Is that the one that says he's invading Syria, or is that the other one? Is that Thomas the Presbyter?
Thomas the Presbyter says he's invading Syria. He does mention the name Muhammad.
And Thomas also, according to the writer of this, meant like that he led some kind of movement. So
so you've got Doctrina Iacobi that, as Jay says, does not mention Muhammad. I had thought that it did, but I haven't looked at these things today. In any case, it does discuss this prophet, but it says that he is preaching, what is it, the one who is to come or something like that?
And he comes with the keys to paradise.
Yes. So there is no such. No, he's preaching isn't he saying that somebody else is going to come after him?
He does say that, and he also says he's bringing the keys to paradise.
Neither one of those things or anything that's in the canonical Islamic literature about Muhammad. Right. He's the seal of the prophets. He's the last one, so nobody's going to come after him. And he doesn't bring the keys to paradise. That's something that you find in the Gospel of Matthew, but you don't find in the Quran or in the Hadith. So that's one problem. that if that prophet is the Muhammad that we know, what is ascribed to him is completely different from what we know about Muhammad from the canonical sources. So it may be some connection to one of the people whose legends were incorporated into the Muhammad myth, but it doesn't get us anywhere closer to the Muhammad of Islam. And it's the same thing with the other one, excuse me, that mentions the Tayyeh of Muhammad that are invading Syria. Is that the one, the Thomas the Presbyter J?
Iyas ibn Qabisa. Iyas ibn Qabisa is from Tayyeh. He is a Lakhmid king. He does have 30, he was given 30 villages by Khusrau, the Sassanian. He was a Sassanian to begin with, and then in 622, he then changes, moves over with the Arabs, and he is the one that has the agreement, and his nickname is Muhammad, or Muhammad. That is his nickname. So it's obviously that Thomas the Presbyter is referring to him, not the Muhammad of the 9th century.
So Medina, Medina,
he lives way up in Hira, in what is today Kufa, just southwest of Baghdad. So he lives hundreds of miles further north, and he lives far to the east. He is the one that introduces the whole Arab identity, because he then confronts the Sassanians who have been destroyed by Heraclius in 622. That's why 622 is so important, because that's the beginning of this identity of the Arabs. Now he then, once he does that and brings this relationship with the Jews finally in place, that makes sense, because remember, the seminaries for the Jews and the Christians are in Hira, where he grew up. So he was very much aware of that. More than likely, this Mahmet, who is from Tayyeh, he was a Christian. That is completely lost in the Islamic traditions. So the 7th century Muhammad was a Christian, not the one that we see in the traditions. And that's why we're saying you need to go with the evidence that's in the ground from the 7th century. That's what Robert's been doing since 2012. That's what I've been doing since 1995, when I first debated this with Dr. Jamal Badawi there at Cambridge University. Now, what's fascinating, I'm not going to go into all the material. I gave about 30 different areas where I think that we now have evidence. We could go into all the rock inscriptions. None of them refer to Muhammad, yet they're from the very time that Muhammad existed. We could go into the coins. The coins are probably the most damaging, because the coins they're minted by these Arab leaders in 620, 630, 640, 650, up until Muawiyah in 661. His coins are then minted. Nothing, again, as Robert's been saying, there's nothing on any of these coins for someone named Abu Bakr or Umar or Uthman or Ali. Their names don't appear. Yet that's how you introduce yourself when you're a leader. You introduce yourself with coins. No, none of them are on those coins. Muawiyah is the first of what we would think of as a Muslim leader, but he has nothing to do with Islam, because all of his coins in the east, which are silver, are all Zoroastrian. All of his coins in the west, which are gold and copper, are Christian. He's wearing a cross on his head. He's holding a cross in his hand. Why would a Muslim be holding a cross in his hand? Can you see? Muawiyah is not a Muslim. And he has the star and the moon, which is a Sassanian royal power. That is a political symbol. That was Sassanian, because he is minting these coins in Iran, which is the Sassanid area. But I think we could go into a whole pile of this if we want to. I don't think that's important. What I would like to do is segue a little bit into this idea as we being the myth makers, Robert. Remember, he said we're the myth makers, we're the ones that are conspiracy theorists. And he missed, I think, the most important argument that every Muslim, whenever I brought any of this material for, they always come back with one argument. They would never come back with a principle of embarrassment, for one very good reason. They don't think he's embarrassing. He's quite normal. In fact, we think he's embarrassing because we're looking at him with biblical eyes. And from a biblical perspective, he is absolutely embarrassing. And that's why I say, when you look at a lot of David Wood's if you go up on his YouTube, there aren't many Muslims looking at his YouTube. Take a look at all the comments. Very few Muslims. When you look at our YouTube, they're full of Muslims. Why is it they're all watching our YouTubes and they're not watching David's? Because the principle of embarrassment, which he spends all his time on, really doesn't all it does is offend them. They feel offended by it, but they don't see it as anything that's going to change their mind, because they don't see it offensive. They realize that we see it as offensive. Now, the one argument they always come back with is the argument from silence. That's the one David never used on the day. He should have gone to the argument of silence. Dr. Jamal Badawi said that of me. He said, you have nothing to show for what you're saying. it is all silence. But evidence of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, which is what you hear all the time. Now, how do you deal with that one? Because this one I love. I wish David had gone into this. How would you deal with this, Robert? The fact that we do not have any evidence for Muhammad in the 7th century, and they have all the evidence from the 9th century.
Well, there's so many problems with that. There's so many ways to tackle that. One of the primary ones that I use generally is to say that the argument from silence in this case is much more significant because the actions of the people involved are supposed to be motivated by the teachings that aren't there. And so that is connected to what I was saying before, that you have, for example, these invaders, and they're supposed to be motivated by the martial teachings of the Quran and Muhammad, and yet they never mention the martial teachings of the Quran and Muhammad. That's not your ordinary argument from silence. You have Muawiyah with his coins with crosses on them, and he's a Muslim ruler. There was a Muslim reviewer of the first edition of Did Muhammad Exist who said that I make a great deal of the fact that some of the early Muslim coins have crosses on them. And really, that just shows Islamic tolerance and how they had a light touch when they conquered Christians and allowed them to continue to put crosses on the coins. Well, in the first place, we know that Islamic rulers have never acted that way anywhere in history. You can read my other book, The History of Jihad, and see that everywhere, without any exception, that Islamic jihad armies have conquered, they've ruled with a very heavy hand whenever they were obeying Islamic law, and that meant that the Christians were sharply rebuked and restricted in their observance of their faith, and that particularly that meant public display of the cross, because Muhammad says that Jesus is going to come back and break the cross, and the Quran says that they did not kill or crucify him. So
Robert, would you not say also that Muhammad, the Muhammad of the traditions, is very much in that paradigm? Did he ever broker anybody to confront him? Or look what he did with Marwan, Asma bin Marwan, who only wrote poetic verse against him. He had her assassinated. He had 25 people assassinated. Look what he did to the Jews, the Banu Kainuka family, the Banu Nadir family, the Banu Quraiza family. They wouldn't support him and would not sign the Constitution of Medina. He had them thrown out, or he had them executed, had their throats slit, and the women taken as slaves. So Muhammad, the Muhammad of the tradition that David and the Kay are trying to support, was very much a bombastic and very much a militaristic.
Sorry, stop right there, sir. Don't throw me under the David bus. At the moment, on a fence. I'm on a peripheral.
Well, she's climbed up onto the fence in this last hour. Have you noticed?
Well, because
I don't mind the devil.
I mean, I just need to find my tinfoil hat at least. I can't just bring out the crazy, as it were. Not now.
You're absolutely right. You know, it is an Islamic apologetics point nowadays. I encounter this all the time. Nihad Awad of the Council on American Islamic Relations and so many others, they go before the media whenever there is like something like the beheading of the French teacher not long ago for showing a cartoon of Muhammad. And we hear it again and again and again, that Muhammad behaved gently. Muhammad was kind and respectful toward those who insulted him and mocked him and ridiculed him. This is absolutely false according to the canonical Islamic literature, as Jay has pointed out. And as a result, the Muslims read the canonical Islamic literature and they believe it. And so they have never, the believers in that canonical Islamic literature, behaved anything but harshly toward non-Muslims, and particularly toward the cross. So the idea that a Muslim ruler, Muawiyah, would have put crosses on the coins it flies in the face of any kind of rational calculation of how he would have behaved. And so it's not remotely like just an argument from silence, because it's not just a silence, it's a direct transgression of the principles upon which his state is supposed to be based. Yeah. And we have before him, the rightly guided caliphs, so-called, the four caliphs the four original caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. And they're supposed to be the golden age, the perfect guys. I mean, the ones who give us the best example of what a caliphate is supposed to be. And they're immediately, if we're going to believe that this is just this strange argument from silence omission, then they completely ignored and sometimes outright denied the basis and foundation of their faith and their political polity and their political entity. So it's ridiculous to think that this thing it arises, it is hatched by Muhammad, whether he was a true or a false prophet, that it comes from him, and then his immediate followers, his closest friends, the people who admired him the most, immediately threw it away and ignored it and trampled upon it. And it wasn't until decades later that it was revived. It's ridiculous, really.
Let me just say this and end with this, and this is probably where we can bring it to a conclusion. When you stop and think, Robert, we've been called the myth makers. We're the ones that are coming up with this conspiracy theory. Could we not turn that same argument and turn it right around onto people like David Hutton's in the same camp? Could we not say that they are the myth makers? And can we not say really that all Muslims, every time they go back and they start referring to the 9th and 10th century traditions about this Muhammad, that they are now the myth makers because they cannot support anything that they are saying in the 7th century. And we suddenly are no longer the myth makers. We're not the conspiracy theorists. We are the realists because we are coming up with evidence from the 7th century, which they refuse to do. And in any historical critique, is that not what a historian should do? A historian should not listen to that redactions coming from the 9th and 10th century. They should always go back to the environment and the place and the setting and the person that they're referring to. And that becomes the narrative that then confronts the other. And the myth makers are those that are creating a myth. In this case, I would say they are the myth makers, and this myth was created by the Abbasids, and it started from 749, around 750, you are correct. And I would say that this book here is not from Ibn Ishaq, even though it says Ibn Ishaq. This has nothing to do with Ibn Ishaq. This has everything to do with Ibn Hisham. This comes another 70 years later, so it's taken them 70 years to finally standardize because Ibn Ishaq got it wrong. And that's why they threw it out and they created this more. So they needed that myth. And the myth that they finally came to was the Ibn Hisham, the Muhammad of Ibn Hisham. But they still didn't have his sayings. And that took him another 40 years to even get that put together. And that's why al-Bukhari was given 600,000 of these very real stories, and he whittles them down to 7,397. That's the myth, and that's the conspiracy that they want. So I would suggest that now Islam, the Islam that we're practicing today, is the myth, is the legend, and I would say it is the conspiracy that was created by the Abbasids, because that is their narrative now. They needed him more than anybody else. And I therefore want to go to the Muhammad of history. I'm sick and tired of the Muhammad of faith, because that's all you're getting, and that's all we've been taught. Let's go back to the Muhammad of history. That's why I can't wait for your next book to come up, because your book, and this is here, I have the first facsimile of it. I'm the first one to own it. I don't even have a cover for it yet. So I am the first one because you gave me a pre-publication copy. I'm going to be the first one to say, folks, get this book. Because that is going to be, we're starting to scratch, we're starting to find who the real Muhammad is. And the real Muhammad that we're going to be introducing, that Robert's going to be introducing, is not the Muhammad of the 9th century. But it looks like we pretty well know what did happen in the 7th century. And I can't wait to get your book. I've got it already, so what am I saying? But I can't wait till everybody else to get your book. We'll give you the last say, Robert, because this is your material and this is your time.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. You're really the trendsetter. You're the pioneer, I should say, in this field. And my hat's off to you. I appreciate your kind words very much. I thought your point in the debate with David was very extraordinarily precise. It was a Moab of its own in saying that he, as a Christian, ought to be reading the Gospel of Thomas if he is going to be working the way he works with Islam, because the Gospel of Thomas, instead of being something from the time of the apostles, comes up a couple hundred years later. And so if he's
Exactly
going to take
200 years
material
later,
about
just like Ibn Hisham.
yeah. So if he's going to take material about Muhammad that's a couple hundred years later and act as if it's authentic, at the expense of what you've discovered and others have discovered about the actual historical circumstances of the origins of Islam, then likewise he should throw out the canonical Gospels and go with the Gnostic Apocrypha from 200 years later. I was laughing. That's a very powerful point that
You know, David never picked up on it. He never, I don't even think he understood.
Sure. But that shows who's wearing the tinfoil hat and who is the myth maker indeed.
Okay, good stuff. Okay, you're muted.
Yeah, I was going to say Mohammed picked up on it because it finds its way into the Quran. So either Jibril was a fan of Thomas or certainly Mohammed. So,
oh, you know, Kay, that reminds me of one thing. I don't want to prolong, keep everyone too long, but it's important, I think, to note that a lot of this material, the principle of embarrassment material that we were discussing earlier, it reflects cultural practices of the time. And even though there were Jews and there were heretical Christians and so on, that somehow were connected with the origins of this thing, it's a vastly different moral environment. And a lot of the practices that we would find terrible, like the child marriage and so on, were what the people of the time took for granted and they canonized when they put their prophet together and their religion together. And this is one of the reasons why we see traces of this today, that nowadays we see when people talk about things like female genital mutilation or honor killing, that there is not very strong or clear attestation for its being Islamic. And so it's routinely dismissed in the establishment media as being cultural, as if in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or Iran, there is some non-Muslim cultural practice that has persisted despite the overwhelming dominance of Islam for centuries in these countries. It strains credulity, but also it ignores the fact
that, you mean? Just like the eating of pork and the uncovered shoulders and the just general wafting around of everybody else in major Muslim countries. No, of course
that
not.
all these cultural practices, and actually there's not that sharp a distinction between them and Islam, because Islam is to a tremendous degree the canonization of cultural practices of the time and place in which it was made. And so it shouldn't be surprising that we find that these same cultural practices that have some attestation in Islam or a bit of a slight attestation in Islam, they are nonetheless deeply rooted in Islamic culture because they predate Islam itself and they arise from the same well springs.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess I'm going to have the last word, even though I'm not an expert at all. One of my last words is please do look on Amazon and pre-order, because obviously deliveries and stuff can be a little bit disrupted by our current status quo. Also, while you're at it, I mean, it'd still be a Christmas gift, I guess, or an Easter gift if you pre-order for somebody else. Also, Jay has an extensive back catalogue, as does Robert. I have not, so don't bother looking for any of mine. I guess someone needs to go and excavate the grave of Mohammed just to have a look and find out like who is in there. We can hopefully come back and discuss again, like who. So now you've established, sorry, I'm still on the, I don't want to go against David, to be fair, because I love his stuff. I also love you both. So I'm just going to rise above this.
But what are the foremost collectors of the age.
He won't watch.
Extraordinary. It's a hallmark of the fact that we are Christians and not Muslims, that we are able to have disagreement and love each other and continue to respect one another's work. If we were all Muslims, maybe one or more of us would be dead at this point.
Well, okay, murderous intent.
Let me just say one thing, Kate.
Sorry, can I just put this?
Let me just finish on this point. continue to support David. There's no reason why you should go against David. David has to do this. Hatun has to do this. Sam Shamoun has to do this, because the vast majority, 99.9% of Muslims still believe that Muhammad, the Muhammad of the tradition, is their Muhammad.
Yeah.
Therefore, we've got to shut that Muhammad down. So David needs to continue. So do you. So do anybody else. In fact, that was my career. That's what my career was back when I was their age. I did that all the time. I've moved now into the historical critique because of the material that's now, the historical material that's come to the fore. But please, can you understand, whether David wins or I win, Muhammad loses.
Loses. Exactly. That's perfect. And what I would also like to add is that as Christians, none of us, I'm sure, I wouldn't like to speak for Sam because I just wouldn't, but I'm sure that Sam, Hatun, David, yourself, Robert, and I all agree that whoever Mohammed was, whether he was another dude, whether he was an amalgamation of people, whether he was just a complete fabrication, none of them, the Mohammed who is accepted within Islam is not. None of us Christians believe in a guy who potentially spat in a well and the water was somehow miraculously transformed, or defecated in the desert and an oasis may have appeared, or you know, like went so clearly against the teachings of Yahweh and yet was somehow like you know, riding off on donkeys and you know, basically that kind of I was gonna
You're
say
making an
that
excellent
kind of
point.
I've never heard of this pooping oases. Where does that come from?
Well, no, I think the hadith is that oh my gosh, maybe I'll clip this out, but wherever the ground would swallow it up, and I don't know, some fragrant something or other. But toilet humor aside, I don't buy it.
There you go. There's your next book, Robert. There's your next book. The man who pooped oases all over the Middle East.
No, the other serious.
All my books are already in that vein.
The other serious thing I'd say is that between you both, potentially, so Book and the Man, as it were, which is the entirety of Islam, apart from the 200-year, you know, other stories that come later, which all good myths have to be bolstered potentially by like external stuff. But between you, one of you has managed to be central in taking down the book and the other the man. So I feel pretty blessed to be able to say that I know you both and have great affection for you both. And thank you very much for tolerating my ignorance on this subject and being benign enough to allow me to ask my question.
One very small final point is that your point about the fact that as Christians we know that there's nothing good in Muhammad's example is very important in light of the fact that there's so many Christian leaders who are pretending. Even I came across, I can't remember who it was, but it was at Jihad Watch the other day, my website. It's a news site, and there was a Christian bishop, I think, Anglican or Catholic, I forget what he was, but in any case, talking about the prophet and saying how important it was that we recognize that we all worship the same God. This is a very dangerous and destructive idea that is causing a lot of damage. It's keeping people from speaking out about Muslim persecution of Christians. It is keeping people from challenging the falsehoods of Islam that destroy people's souls. You know, the Lord said, the time will come when men will kill you and think that they're offering service to God. I think that that's an incredible summation of what Islam is. And woe to those who call good evil and evil good. We have a responsibility to call that out, and so many Christian leaders have fallen down on that responsibility. So it's all the more important that we continue to insist on that exact point.
Amen. I completely agree. So on that, oh, sorry, Jay, you're muted.
Let me just say one last thing on this point, and then I'll stop. You notice this whole discussion today has been on whether Muhammad is embarrassing or whether Muhammad even existed. On both points, you can see there is a problem for Islam. Have you noticed, for Christians, there is no argument of embarrassment. There is no principle of embarrassment. Isn't it interesting that, you know, and for 40 years that I've been working with Muslims, I have always asked them, well, they've always come to me and they say, you know, we love Jesus. Why don't you love Muhammad? And my response has always been, exactly, there's the problem. Of course, everybody has a problem with Muhammad, but nobody has a problem with Jesus. Of course, you love Jesus. Who doesn't love Jesus? Even Madonna loves Jesus. I can't think of anybody that doesn't love Jesus because there's nothing embarrassing about him. There's nothing you can throw at him. There's nothing that besmirches his character. Everything Jesus does is as appropriate and as relevant today as it was the day he did it 2,000 years ago. And who else can stand up to every criticism, and even the historical criticism, as you so rightly said, Robert? We have gone through the historical criticism on Jesus for the last 150 years. We're way ahead of Islam in this historical problem. And that's the beauty of it. The historical critique, whereas it destroys Muhammad historically, it actually elevates Jesus historically. The Jesus of faith is the Jesus of history. The Muhammad of faith is nothing like the Muhammad of history. And that's the beauty of this whole discussion. When you do a like with like, I'm so glad that I don't have to defend Jesus on this. I'm so glad that there aren't Muslims out there sitting there slagging off Jesus. They can't, they daren't. Nobody can, because there's nothing us like Jesus. He speaks for himself, he defends himself. And as far as I'm concerned, that's where the whole debate comes back down to.
Yeah. I'd just like to say, for any sincere Muslims who are watching, who are sincerely interested in knowing the truth, aside from the fact that the truth is Jesus Christ, and he attests even to this in the Bible, which is available from all good bookstores, and you don't need to pre-order it. It's been around for a long time. It's been pored over and criticized and researched and attested to, and the books within the Bible that are referred, other external books are also available for your reference. None of that I know of have ever had an event in history where they've all been burned and standardized. Every English translation is, of course, only one step away from the Greek or the Hebrew. They don't just go around like transcribing the last English one and the last English one. But for sincere Muslims, please don't, if possible, take offense at what we're saying, but with an open heart and an inquiring mind. Even though Mohammed says in references, don't ask questions, you're not asking questions if you're doing your own research. I think you're allowed to ask yourself questions and God questions. I think it's more like don't bother the scholars. So please do look into it. If you'd like any other information, obviously get Robert's book, look at Jay's work on the Quran and the preservation or non-preservation even of the Quran. And between them both, hopefully, they're both coming from a loving place, as am I. Christ says that we must love everybody, so that's you included, whoever you are, you unlucky chap or chapess. But yeah, please do look into it. Don't just have a knee-jerk, I'm being attacked reaction, because as Christians, the Bible, of course, says that you can insult Jesus. You can actually insult the Father, just you must not insult the Holy Spirit. Whereas I find it pretty suspicious that Muhammad is included in this blasphemy kind of prohibition, because really you only need to defend so vociferously a lie. If the truth speaks for itself and it can't be diluted or attacked or made lesser by falsehoods. So if what these guys are saying and what I'm considering isn't true, it should be pretty easy with God on your side to prove that. And you may find that you come to a different conclusion, and the real historical Jesus, not Isa, who is the only way to the one true God. And on that bombshell, that's a spoiler alert for anyone who didn't know the message of Christianity. I think I'm going to wrap it up. Please do come to Jesus, or at least in the quietness of your own room, just pray for the truth, pray for discernment. The Holy Spirit is actually in the Quran, so you can pray for the Holy Spirit to help you out, because Holy Spirit big in the game when it comes to discernment. All right then. Again, I find it difficult to wrap up conversations, as you are both witnessing, and so is everybody else. But I'm going to stop recording now and say please do subscribe to Jay's channel, Fanda Films, with a P and an F. And Robert's, yours Jihad Watch on YouTube?
No, I think it's Jihad Watch Video. I really need to do more with it.
He's not fussed. He's a big-time author, everyone. I mean, but yeah, please do go and subscribe there. Soko Films, and of course, Soko Films. And lastly, Soko Studio, because that's a backup channel, because you never know what you never know. So anyway, God bless you all. Take care, and bye-bye.